Well, look who decided to launch some beautifully boring neutral palettes. I have all three from Prada Beauty to review for you here today, and as per usual, I'm going to be sharing my completely honest thoughts. We have some demos in natural light with each of these palettes, a couple of comparisons. Are these the next best thing, or are they just another overpriced neutral palette? Let's get into it. As mentioned, we have three new palettes in the Prada range. We have Peony, we have Pansy, and we have Primula. And as far as the specs go, they're exactly the same as the other palettes from Prada. They have the same packaging. They are made in France. We got a 24-month shelf life, and there is no fragrance. Oh, and they are also refillable. The formula as well, for the most part, is also the same. We'll get more into that a little bit later into the video. The biggest difference, of course, are the color stories. If you're familiar with the Prada eyeshadow palettes, they are incredibly beautiful. I love them, but the color stories are not as user-friendly as a lot of other luxury brands. You could see right here, this is pretty bold, okay? This is not an everyday palette for me. So I do like the fact that Prada is kind of thinking about their customer, maybe the customer that likes a little bit more of like an everyday subtle look, and they have brought us these new color stories. Let's take a look at each of these palettes in natural light, starting off with number 07, Peony. This is the lightest of the three palettes, and this is described as having delicate beiges illuminated by a powder pink hollow twist. This palette is very, very light. This is going to be good for those of you who, number one, have very fair skin just like me, because it's actually going to show up on you. But also, if you like very neutral, very subtle makeup looks, if you love Chanel eyeshadows, if you love most Dior eyeshadows, I think you're really going to like this. If you are not familiar with the Prada eyeshadow formula, for the most part, it does tend to be very pigmented. I love it. I specifically like it because it has a very creamy texture that is still very blendable. It looks very smooth on the eye. If you have dry eyelids like me or texture, I think you're really going to like it. It's very special, it's very luxurious, it's very unique, but it does tend to be very pigmented, and that's not what everybody likes. If you like the sound of that formula, but you want something that is really subtle, then this color story is going to be for you. It really does not allow any depth. With this palette in particular, I do kind of wish that they had included something else other than this light beige shade. It's really only good if you want to use it as a base. It's like the same color as my skin, so maybe it would show up a little bit differently on somebody else, but just personally, it's kind of redundant. I like to use that kind of a shade for blending, but what am I blending out here? There's nothing like super deep for me to really need to blend. So for me, that's a little bit of a throwaway. That's my one qualm with this palette. Now, one detail that I want to mention, and you might have noticed this when you looked at the swatches and you saw the look with this palette, these palettes compared to the OG ones, I'll show you this one for comparison, they are a little bit softer in that instead of having a mix of mattes and high shine metallics, see that bright silver right there in the Profusion palette, these have a mixture of, I would say they're more like demi mattes. They have a little bit of soft shimmer to them, and then each of the palettes have this beautiful, I like to call it a stunna shade. It's basically a very subtle, very elegant, very finely milled holographic shade. I wouldn't necessarily call it a topper shade because there is some opacity to it in all of the palettes, but it's just like a beautiful soft shimmer shade. It's not glittery, it's not chunky. I think they did a really nice job with this formula, but it is different than the OG palettes, so I do want to mention that. Next up, we have the palette that I'm wearing on my eyes today, which is number 08, Pansy, and this one is described as having neutral coral and peach tones, which create a luminous and sophisticated look highlighted by a begonia hollow twist. Notice how this is going to be deeper than the last palette. It's more of a medium tone, I would say. It also is much pinker in tone. This is giving me like Charlotte Tilbury Pillow Talk types of vibes. It's not completely pink, it's more of like a neutral pink. And I do think that this is probably going to be the most popular of the three because it is, like I said, it's more medium in tone. I think these colors are going to show up on a good range of skin tones. You also have this nice kind of rose gold brown right there, which you can use to create a little bit more depth. Also, the deeper rose color is great for creating a little bit more depth in the crease. If you don't use that shade, it certainly looks a lot less pink. And what I really really like about this palette is that little holographic shade. This shade really makes the palette. I feel like it pops so much more than the one in the Peony palette. That one is much more subtle. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but I really like the contrast of the holographic shade here in the Pansy palette. And you can see the final look here. It's very beautiful. It's very natural. It is very everyday, but I do like that kind of subtle, you know, gleam that you get from the shimmer shade that is in this palette. And lastly, we have number 9, Primula, and this is described as having deep tones, ranging from a vibrant terracotta to a rich reddish deep brown contrasted by an aqua hollow twist. And for sure, this one is definitely the deepest palette. It is quite pigmented. You are gonna get more of a, what I would call an evening look, maybe a smoky look on my skin tone. If you have a deeper skin tone, this is gonna be more of like a neutral palette for you. It also is quite warm, which if you follow me here on my channel, you will know I do like warm tones, but I want to warn you, especially because this center shade right here, it is that warm terracotta reddish brown. The looks are gonna come, they're gonna come out quite warm, okay? And if you're looking for something very subtle, this really is not the palette for you if you are fair like me, because you don't have any shades in here that are like a light one and done. For me, this is more of a, you know, date night, going out to dinner type of palette. I mean, I could wear this out during the day and I would feel fabulous, but it's not going to be the palette that I reach for when I only have like 5 minutes to get ready in the morning. If I have a quick Zoom call or something, this isn't going to be the palette that I reach for. What I really like about this palette, maybe even more than the last one, I really like the holographic shade in this one. They describe this as a aqua hollow twist, and for sure, this shade, it has a little bit of blue, it has a little bit of violet. It looks so good layered on top of the other shades. In fact, I think that this one is my favorite palette. I just really liked the look that I created. It has everything that I like about a more, you know, smoky evening palette. You got the neutrals, a little bit of warmth, you got the Stunna shade. I feel like this one is the most unique, so for that reason, it's my favorite. So in summary, we have Peony, the lightest of the three. Very, very subtle, good for fair skin tones if you want something extremely neutral, very everyday, but you really like that Prada Beauty formula. One thing to keep in mind is that that Stunna shade is not gonna be as much of a pop as the other two palettes. Then we have Pansy, gonna be more medium in tone. This one does have some really nice contrast from the holographic shade. However, it is going to pull quite pink, so something to keep in mind. And finally, we have Primula, which is the deepest one. This is going to pull quite warm. It's also going to be very dark, better for deeper skin tones, but man, that holographic shade is just so gorgeous, and this one is my favorite. Overall, I think that this was a very, very smart business move by Prada Beauty, because while the original line of palettes are stunning, and I like the creativity that they brought to the luxury space, and I really like the fact that they celebrated their house codes and the Prada colors. However, a lot of us, we do just want a bougie, boring, neutral palette for every day. For a lot of consumers, if they're going to spend $85 on a palette, they want it to be something that they're gonna get some good use out of. It's really nice to pick up something very beautiful and luxurious in terms of the packaging, the formula, the whole experience to use on a daily basis. To me, that is worth the $85. And I also think it was smart of them to put in these little holographic shades to add something different, okay? It's not just a neutral palette. There is a little bit of intrigue there. So I think it was a smart move on their behalf. All of that being said, you know, these color stories, do I really need to tell you that these are not groundbreaking? They are so repetitive. So it's really up to you to decide, do any of these speak to you? I bet you already have these colors in your collection. I don't have any complaints about these palettes other than the fact that, I don't know, the color stories are boring and are very repetitive, but I think that's what a lot of people are looking for. So you just have to ask yourself, do you want something that is truly unique? Because these aren't, okay? Do you want something that is truly unique? Or are you looking for like a super luxurious, perfect, everyday palette that you just really enjoy using every day. If that is the case, then for the $85, this might be worth it to you. Now, lastly, I know a lot of you love comparisons, you find them very helpful. I'm not gonna swatch these next to every neutral palette that I have in my collection. If you have a Charlotte Tilbury palette, if you have any other neutral palette, you probably can dupe these except for those holographic shades. But I do wanna point out some other brands that have very similar formulas. So maybe you could skip on these if you have any of these palettes. The first palette line that I wanna point out are the ones from YSL. This formula, it's not exact, but it's very, very similar. It has a slightly creamy texture. It looks very, very similar on the lid. And a lot of these palettes also have those kinds of topper shades included in them. I'll show you guys some side-by-side comparisons so you can see the difference in the finishes. I would say the mattes look really similar to the ones from Prada. The shimmer shades in the YSL palettes are quite glittery, however. So if these were always a little bit too glittery for you, I actually would highly recommend checking out the Prada palettes. And then, you know, if the Prada palettes are not enough for you and you want a little bit more of a pop, then definitely go for the YSL. The other palette that I have right here is from Byredo. This is the Byredo Remembrance palette. This is not available anymore, I'm sorry, but Byredo comes out with new palettes every single year. And I just wanted to point out that this formula is also somewhat similar to the one from Prada Beauty. And if you have this palette, you can dupe a lot of the shades. It's very much a similar vibe. You got your neutrals, you got your pinks, you have some beautiful shimmers and toppers in here. So if you have this palette as well, maybe pull it out and just think to yourself, do I really need one of the $85 ones from Prada? Comment down below and let me know, what do you think of these new palettes from Prada Beauty? Do you think they're super boring? Are you really excited for these new neutral color stories? I would love to know. If you like this video, please don't forget to give me a big thumbs up and subscribe, or better yet, go watch another video. Up next, I have even more reviews of the Prada Beauty products. I'll see you there.